November 1943. The Tunisian valley fills with smoke so thick the gunner can taste metal on his tongue. Inside the Sherman, Sergeant William Marsh presses his cheek against the gun sight, but there's nothing to see, just gray, just drifting curtains of dust and cordite that turn the world into a blindfold. The radio crackles. Enemy armor, 300 yards, maybe closer. The commander's voice is tight. They're sitting targets if they don't fire first. Marsh pulls back from the sight, closes his eyes. The other crew members think he's praying, but he's listening. The diesel rumble of their own engine, the hiss of hydraulics, and beneath it all, something else, a lower frequency, rhythmic, German. He counts the seconds between the sound hitting his ears and the faint return echo bouncing off canyon walls. His hand moves to the elevation wheel. He's done this twice before. Both times the math worked. Both times metal found metal in the invisible distance. He doesn't know if there's a name for what he does. He only knows that when you can't see death coming, you learn to hear it instead. By mid-1943, tank warfare had evolved into something the textbooks never predicted. The North African campaign taught Allied crews that visibility was a luxury, not a guarantee. Sandstorms could erase the horizon in seconds. Artillery barrages turned battlefields into fog banks. Burning wrecks belched oil smoke that hung in the air for hours. German forces exploited these conditions ruthlessly. Their Panzer IV and Tiger tanks carried superior Zeiss optics, rangefinders calibrated to pick out targets at distances where Allied Shermans were still squinting through haze. The problem wasn't just equipment, it was geometry. A tank duel in clear conditions followed predictable rules. Spot the enemy, estimate range, adjust for drop, fire. But when smoke or dust reduced visibility to 50 yards, those rules collapsed. Crews fired blind, wasting ammunition on shadows. Others hesitated, waiting for a clear shot that never came, only to take an 88mm round through the turret. Intelligence reports from the British 8th Army documented the pattern. In low-visibility engagements, Allied tanks were being destroyed at twice the rate of clear-weather battles. Training manuals offered no solution. Gunnery schools taught estimation techniques using visual landmarks. A tank at 400 yards fills this much of your sight picture. A Panzer at 600 has this silhouette. But what happens when there are no landmarks? When the enemy is a sound, a vibration, a shell that announces itself only by killing you? Crews developed superstitions. Some gunners claimed they could smell German diesel. Others swore they felt the ground shake differently when a Tiger moved. Most of these instincts were panic dressed as intuition, but some men, a rare few, began to notice patterns that the manuals had missed. Sound had always been part of tank combat, but no one treated it as actionable intelligence. Engine noise gave away positions. Track clatter revealed movement. But these were warnings, not weapons. The idea that a gunner could use acoustics to calculate firing solutions seemed absurd. Human ears weren't instruments. They couldn't measure distance with the precision required to land a shell on a moving target. Yet the physics existed whether doctrine acknowledged them or not. Every surface in a confined space, every ridge and rock face reflected sound waves at predictable intervals. The delay between a noise and its echo corresponded directly to distance. It was the same principle bats used to hunt insects in total darkness. William Marsh didn't study physics. He'd been a machinist before the war, working in a Birmingham factory where tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. His job required him to detect defects by listening to engine irregularities, distinguishing between normal vibration and the subtle wrongness that meant something was about to fail. When his Sherman crew first deployed to Tunisia in early 1943, he noticed immediately how sound behaved differently in the wadis and canyons. Shout into the valley and your voice came back changed. Fire a machine gun burst and the echo arrived a heartbeat later. His commander dismissed it as curiosity. Marsh kept listening. The breakthrough came during a skirmish near Kasserine Pass. Caught in a dust storm, his crew had fired 11 rounds without scoring a hit. Ammunition was running low. Marsh asked the driver to shut down the engine for 30 seconds. In the sudden silence, he heard it clearly. The diesel growl of a Panzer, maybe two, somewhere ahead and to the left. But it wasn't just the engine noise. There was a secondary pulse. Fainter, arriving a fraction of a second later. The echo. He did the calculation in his head the way he'd estimate machine tolerances. Sound traveled roughly 1,000 feet per second. If the delay was half a second, the target was 500 feet out. 250 if you split the difference between the sound and its return. He called the range. The loader chambered around. Marsh fired into nothing but gray air. 10 seconds later, they heard the unmistakable crump of a penetrating hit. Marsh never called it echolocation. To him, it was just listening with purpose, but the mental process required a kind of sensory discipline that most people never develop. Inside a Sherman tank, the ambient noise level during combat hovered around 110 decibels, equivalent to standing next to a chainsaw. Radio chatter, mechanical clatter, the gunner's own breathing amplified inside a steel box. Filtering that chaos into usable information meant shutting down everything else. Marsh described it later as similar to tuning a radio through static. You didn't force it. You relaxed into it until the signal separated from the noise. His crewmates noticed he rarely spoke during approaches. He'd rest one hand flat against the turret wall, feeling vibrations, his eyes closed or staring at nothing. They thought he was anxious. He was calibrating. The method demanded physical stillness. Any movement inside the tank created interference. Marsh trained himself to breathe shallowly, to keep his head motionless against the gun mount. Even his heartbeat became a variable he had to account for, the pulse in his ears sometimes masking lower frequencies. The stress was enormous. A miscalculation meant wasting a shell, or worse, revealing their position without landing a hit. But Marsh had one advantage that training couldn't teach: absolute confidence in his own perception. He trusted what he heard more than what he saw, and in conditions where vision failed completely, that trust became a combat multiplier. The principle was simple. The execution was anything but. Sound waves travel at different speeds depending on air temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. In the North African heat, sound moved faster than in the European cold. Canyon walls reflected echoes cleanly, but open deserts scattered them into uselessness. Marsh couldn't account for all these variables scientifically, but he could feel them intuitively. After dozens of engagements, his brain built a database of acoustic signatures. A Panzer IV sounded different from a Tiger. The echo off limestone cliffs came back sharper than sandstone. Wind direction changed everything. The technique only worked in specific terrain. Open plains offered nothing for sound to bounce off. Dense urban combat created too many overlapping echoes to parse. But the wadis of North Africa, the hedgerow valleys of Normandy, the narrow alpine passes of Italy, these environments turned sound into geometry. Marsh's crew began requesting assignments in confined spaces where visibility was naturally poor. Other tank commanders avoided these positions. They were kill zones, places where a single well-placed Panzer could ambush an entire column. But for Marsh, they were hunting grounds. His crew developed tactics around his ability. They'd advance slowly, engine idling, pausing every 100 yards. Marsh would listen, call adjustments, and they'd reposition before firing. Hit rates climbed, survival rates followed. Word spread quietly through the battalion. Gunners asked Marsh to explain his method, but he struggled to articulate it. How do you teach someone to hear distance? A few attempted to replicate the technique. Most gave up after a few tries, frustrated by their inability to distinguish meaningful echoes from ambient noise. One Canadian gunner, however, claimed limited success using a modified approach, tapping the turret wall with a wrench and timing the return sound. Whether it actually worked or was simply coincidence, no official records exist. The British Army never formalized acoustic targeting as doctrine. It remained an individual skill, born from desperation and refined through repetition. German tank crews operated under their own assumptions. Their superior optics gave them confidence in low visibility conditions. They knew Allied Shermans struggled at range, so they used smoke and dust as cover to close distance before striking. What they didn't anticipate was being targeted by a gunner who wasn't even looking. After-action reports captured from Wehrmacht. Kate units in Tunisia mentioned phantom hits, rounds arriving from unexpected angles with no apparent line of sight. Some German commanders theorized the Allies had deployed new acoustic ranging equipment. They were half right. The equipment was one man's ears, and it was unrepeatable, undetectable, and utterly terrifying to face. December 8, 1943. The engagement that would define Marsh's war began in fog so dense the crew couldn't see their own tank's bow. They were part of a reconnaissance patrol probing German positions near Tabourba, a cluster of hills 20 miles west of Tunis. Intelligence suggested light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. At 0720 hours, the lead Sherman in their column exploded without warning. No muzzle flash, no visual contact, just the sudden roar of ignition and screaming over the radio. The second tank reversed frantically, throwing track, trying to escape. Another hit. This time they heard it first, the crack of an 88-meter round traveling faster than sound, followed by the impact. Marsh's Sherman was third in line. His commander ordered full stop. The driver killed the engine. In the silence, they could hear the surviving crew from the second tank bailing out, boots hitting gravel, men running. Marsh pressed his forehead against the gun sight, knowing it was useless. The fog wasn't lifting, it was thickening. Somewhere out there, at least one Panzer was picking them apart methodically, using the fog as a cloak. The German crew had perfect patience. They could wait. Marsh's unit could not. He pulled back from the sight and closed his eyes. The commander started to speak, but Marsh raised one hand, a silent request for quiet. He needed to hear past the fear, past the hammering of his own pulse. The fog muffled sound, absorbed it, but it didn't eliminate physics. He listened. 30 seconds. A minute. Then he caught it. A low mechanical pulse, rhythmic. And distinct from any Allied engine, German diesel. But the echo was strange. It wasn't bouncing cleanly. It was splitting, arriving in two overlapping waves. That meant the Panzer was positioned between two reflecting surfaces, the hills. It was hull down in a natural depression, using the terrain for cover. Marsh opened his eyes and did the math. The primary sound arrived, then the first echo off the left ridge after roughly 0.4 seconds, the second echo off the right ridge a fraction later. That stagger told him angle. The delay told him range. 400 yards, maybe 420, positioned 10 degrees left of their center line. He couldn't see it, he would never see it, but he knew exactly where it was. Marsh called the bearing and range to his commander. The numbers sounded insane. Firing blind into fog at a target 400 yards away based on engine noise. It violated every principle of armored warfare, but the alternative was waiting to die. The commander gave the order. Marsh traversed the turret left, counting degrees by the mechanical clicks of the gear. The loader slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. Marsh elevated for 400 yards, adding 2 degrees to account for the upward slope he remembered from their approach. His hand rested on the firing lever. He took one breath, held it, fired. The Sherman rocked backward from recoil. The shell disappeared into gray nothing. For 3 seconds, there was only the ringing in their ears and the smell of propellant. Then they heard it. Not an explosion. Something better. The metallic clang of a penetrating hit, followed immediately by secondary detonations, ammunition cooking off, voices shouting in German. The fog began to glow orange from flames they still couldn't see. Marsh's crew sat frozen, disbelieving. The commander started laughing, a manic edge to it. The driver restarted the engine. They advanced slowly, following the sound of burning diesel. When they reached the Po, 10 minutes later, the fog had thinned enough to see the wreckage. A Panzer IV, turret blown open, smoke pouring from the hatches. Marsh's round had entered the lower glacis plate at a near-perfect 90-degree angle. A shot that required not just correct range, but precise elevation and deflection. The German crew had been so confident in their concealment that they hadn't even repositioned after the first 2 kills. They died without understanding how they'd been targeted. British infantry arrived an hour later to secure the position. They found Marsh's crew standing beside the destroyed Panzer, measuring the distance with a surveyor's tape. 418 yards. Marsh had been off by 18 feet. The story reached battalion headquarters by nightfall. At first, officers assumed it was exaggeration, combat stress turning a lucky shot into mythology. But Marsh's crew corroborated every detail. The commander's after-action report included a full technical description of the acoustic method. 3 days later, a Royal Artillery officer arrived to interview Marsh personally. They spent 4 hours in a tent, the officer taking notes while Marsh tried to explain something he barely understood himself. Could this be taught? Could it be replicated? Marsh didn't know. He only knew that it worked for him, and that knowledge had just saved 5 lives while taking 4. The British Army never issued an official doctrine on acoustic targeting. The concept appeared briefly in a January 1944 training memorandum titled Unconventional Firing Solutions in Reduced Visibility, but it read more like a curiosity than a tactical innovation. The problem was reproducibility. Military doctrine requires methods that can be taught systematically, drilled into thousands of soldiers with predictable results. Marsh's technique was the opposite. It relied on individual sensory acuity, environmental intuition, and a kind of mental calculation that couldn't be reduced to a formula. When gunnery instructors tried to demonstrate the method at training facilities in England, results were inconsistent at best. Some trainees reported success. Most heard nothing useful. A few became so focused on listening that their reaction times in conventional engagements actually slowed. But within Marsh's regiment, the impact was immediate and measurable. His crew's survival rate through the winter of 1943-44 was nearly triple the battalion average. Other gunners began adopting fragments of his approach, even if they couldn't replicate the full method. They learned to recognize enemy engine signatures. They trained themselves to estimate range using sound in combination with visual cues. One Sherman crew developed a technique of firing machine gun bursts and timing the echo to confirm distance before committing to a main gunshot. It wasn't acoustic targeting in the pure sense, but it was adaptation, and adaptation kept them alive. Marsh himself continued using the method through the Italian campaign. His crew fought at Monte Cassino, where the mountainous terrain created ideal acoustic conditions. In narrow alpine passes, his technique proved even more effective than in North Africa. The echoes were cleaner, the geometry more predictable. On March 15, 1944, during the Third Battle for Cassino, Marsh's Sherman destroyed 2 German self-propelled guns and a Panzer IV in heavy fog, all 3 kills achieved without visual contact. Battalion records credited him with 11 confirmed acoustic-assisted kills by the end of the Italian campaign. Unofficially, his crew believed the number was higher, but several engagements occurred in conditions so chaotic that confirmation was impossible. Recognition came slowly and incompletely. Marsh received a military medal in June 1944, the citation praising his exceptional gunnery skills and innovation under fire. The specifics of his acoustic method were mentioned only obliquely. The award ceremony took place in a muddy field outside Rome. Marsh stood at attention while a general pinned the medal to his chest and spoke about valor. What the general didn't mention was that military intelligence had already begun studying Marsh's technique for potential applications beyond tank warfare. Artillery spotters wanted to know if sound ranging could be adapted for indirect fire. Naval officers theorized about submarine detection. The war was pushing technology faster than doctrine could follow, and Marsh had stumbled into a gap between human capability and mechanical innovation. By late 1944, acoustic fire control systems were entering development. The Germans had experimented with directional microphones for anti-aircraft guns. The Americans were testing sonar-inspired ranging devices for coastal defense. These technologies would eventually evolve into the sophisticated acoustic sensors used in modern armored vehicles, systems that can detect, classify, and range enemy vehicles through sound signature analysis alone. But in 1944, these were prototypes and theories. Marsh was doing it with nothing but his ears and a gifted sense of spatial reasoning. His war ended in April 1945 north of Bologna. The Sherman took a Panzerfaust round during a street fight, killing the driver instantly and wounding Marsh severely in the legs and chest. He spent 4 months in a military hospital in Naples, then another 6 recovering in Birmingham. The damage to his hearing was permanent. High-frequency sounds became painful. Crowded rooms overwhelmed him with noise he couldn't filter. The irony wasn't lost on him. The sense that had kept him alive had been destroyed by the war that demanded its use. He never returned to factory work. The machinery was too loud. Instead, he took a job as a bookkeeper, spending his days in quiet offices, where the only sound was the scratch of pencils and the rustle of paper. He rarely spoke about the war. When veterans organizations asked him to talk about his experiences, he politely declined. What he'd done felt too personal, too strange to translate into the language of heroism that post-war Britain wanted to hear. William Marsh died in 1983, largely forgotten outside his family and a few aging crewmates who still sent Christmas cards. No museum exhibit commemorates his innovation. No tactical manual bears his name. Yet his contribution echoes through modern armored warfare in ways he never witnessed. Today's main battle tanks carry acoustic detection systems that can identify enemy vehicles by engine signature, calculate firing solutions in zero visibility, and engage targets the crew will never see with their eyes. The technology is sophisticated, digital, precise. But the principle remains what Marsh discovered in a fog-choked Tunisian valley: that sound carries information vision cannot, and that the human capacity for adaptation under pressure often surpasses the tools we build to replace it. His story represents something warfare rarely acknowledges: the invisible skills, the improvisations born from desperation that never make it into doctrine but change outcomes nonetheless. For every technological breakthrough celebrated in military history, there are 100 small innovations like Marsh's practiced by individuals, refined through terror and lost when those individuals fall silent. The official record remembers the tanks, the battles, the generals. It forgets the machinist-turned-gunner who taught himself to see with sound because the alternative was death. What remains is a reminder that war is ultimately human, regardless of the machinery involved. The most advanced fire control system is still operated by a person making decisions under impossible pressure. Marsh proved that when technology fails, when visibility collapses, when every tactical advantage disappears, the human mind can still find patterns in chaos. He couldn't have explained the physics. He didn't need to. He simply listened when others closed their eyes in fear, and in that listening, he found a way to strike back at an enemy that thought itself invisible. That ability, that refusal to accept blindness as helplessness, is his true legacy. Not written in manuals, but embedded in the persistent human instinct to adapt, survive, and fight even when the fog refuses to lift.